And I look at her and I say, how do you choose joy when your heart is breaking in a million pieces? How do you choose joy?
Is Rick Warren fine? Ever since he suffered the most heartbreaking tragedy of his life on April 5, 2013, it hasn't been the same. And now it looks like things might get worse for him. This is the story of how one family's nightmare became a crusade, and how even the strongest faith can't protect you from the weight of grief that never really goes away. This is the thing most people don't understand about Rick Warren. Before his never-ending grief broke him, the world had already seen him break on national television. Rick had already learned what it felt like to be torn apart in public. Back in 2006, when Saddleback was exploding in size, Rick's name became a lightning rod. His growth made him famous, but it also made him a target. Rick came about the purpose-driven growth model, which many churches didn't agree with. But even he could not have predicted what came next. Congregations across America split because they tried to follow his strategies. Churches dividing, members being pushed out, and friendships in dingy parking lot arguments over worship styles and seating arrangements. Rick hated that. He begged pastors not to force anything, not to expel people, not to treat growth like war. But the damage happened anyway. And every time a church tore itself apart using his playbook, Rick felt responsible. Imagine carrying that, knowing something you created helped thousands thrive and ripped hundreds apart. And then he got worse. In 2008, Rick stepped into a storm he never saw coming. After winning his election, Barack Obama asked him to deliver the inaugural prayer. It should have been an honor. Instead, it became a national scandal. People dug up a letter written to his own congregation, his personal belief that marriage biblically was between one man and one woman. And the fallout wasn't pretty. Rick Warren went from best-selling pastor to a man accused of hate speech, headlines, protests, calls for his removal from the inauguration. The irony. 6 months earlier, he'd been hugging HIV patients, working with gay men and women in his church's AIDS ministry, telling reporters he had real friendships in the LGBTQ community. But none of that mattered. America wanted Avalane. Obama defended him, said disagreement wasn't hatred, said Rick had welcomed him at Saddleback even when they clashed on issues. But the backlash burned anyway. And the strangest part, while one side demanded he apologize, the other side, many fellow evangelicals, began attacking him for the opposite reason. They said he wasn't harsh enough, not militant enough, not angry enough. Rick looked at them and wondered how fighting people could possibly bring them closer to Jesus. No matter what he said, he lost someone. No matter what he did, someone called him a coward. It didn't end there. New accusations flooded in. In 2009 and again in 2012, evangelical pastors criticized Rick for sitting down with Muslims, sharing meals with imams, and attending interfaith conferences about peace, poverty, and global suffering. It talked about being a friend to all because Jesus was. But that simple idea of friendship set off another wave of outrage, compromise, deception, betrayal. They threw the words at him like stones. Every time Rick tried to build a bridge, someone accused him of burning one. However, he was used to controversy, used to criticism, used to hooking up, and discovering strangers had decided what kind of man he was. But none of it prepared him for the pain that came next. Matthew Warren was 7 when the diagnosis came. Clinical depression, the doctors said, and Rick and Kay Warren can't quite wrap their minds around it. How does a child barely old enough to tie his own shoes carry that kind of darkness? But they saw it. The signs were there from the beginning, from when Matthew was just a toddler. Something wasn't right. Something in the wiring of his beautiful, brilliant mind that made the world feel sharper, crueler, heavier than it should. He was the kind of kid who could walk into a room and immediately find a person who was suffering. Maybe because he recognized the pain in others. The same pain that lived inside him every single day. Friends remember Matthew making a belina toward whoever looked uncomfortable at parties, whoever seemed lost in a crowd. He had this gift, this radar for human hurt. The irony cuts deep, doesn't it? The boy who could sense everyone else's darkness was drowning on his own. Rick Warren would later describe his son as incredibly kind, gentle, compassionate, a young man with a brilliant intellect and a sweet spirit that brought comfort to so many people. But that's the public face, the one Matthew showed the world. Behind closed doors, the Warren family was living a different reality. Doctor appointments that never ended, medications that promised relief but delivered nothing, therapy sessions that felt like throwing stones into an ocean, year after year, watching their son struggle with deep depressions that swallowed him whole, panic attacks that came out of nowhere, mood swings that turned his personality inside out. They tried everything. America's best doctors, Rick said. The most advanced treatments, counselors, prayers from thousands of people around the world who didn't even know Matthew's name. The Warren kept his illness quiet, not out of shame, but because it was his to tell, his dignity to protect. How do you explain to your marriage congregation, to the millions who read our books, that your own son is asking you why he can't just die? Because that's what Matthew asked his father. When he was 17 years old, sitting across from Rick, the boy looked at him and said something that would haunt the pastor for the rest of his life. He told his dad it was obvious, painfully obvious, that he wasn't going to be healed. They'd been to the best doctors in the nation. He'd taken the best medicine. They'd tried everything anyone could think of, and nothing worked. So Matthew asked his father the question that no parent should ever have to hear. Why can't I just die and go to heaven? Rick told him he couldn't give up. Thought as a father, he had to believe there might be an answer out there somewhere. Some treatment they hadn't tried yet. Some breakthrough just around the corner. Matthew made it another 10 years after that conversation. 10 years of dreaming, of hoping, of waking up every morning with that same relentless pain wrapped around his brain like barbed wire. But here's what Rick Warren knew in his gut. Even if he couldn't say it out loud, he knew something bad was coming. Call it intuition. Call it a father's fear. Call it whatever you want. He knew that someday, maybe soon, Matthew's pain would become too much to bear. And that knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Every single day. On April 5th, the Warren had a fun evening together. That's what makes it so devastating. They spent time as a family, laughing, talking, and being together. Everything seemed fine. Matthew seemed fine. But depression is a liar. It tells you there's no way out, no relief, no hope, and in what Rick would later call a momentary wave of despair, Matthew went home to his place in Mission Viejo. Sometime around 10 a.m. that Friday morning, he made a decision that would shatter his family into pieces. He shot himself. The call came in the afternoon. Matthew had been found dead in his home from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The gun had its serial number scratched off, an unregistered weapon he'd bought illegally over the internet. In California, where background checks are mandatory, where gun registration is the law, Matthew had found a way around to loft it. Later, Rick would tweet about the person who sold his son the gun, would say he forgave them, would quote Matthew 6 verse 15 about forgiving others so that God will forgive you. But on that Friday, there was no forgiveness, no theology, no purpose. Just a father who had to identify his son's body. Within 30 minutes of getting the news, Rick and Kay's small group arrived. They didn't call, text, or wait for permission. They just showed up on that sidewalk, wrapped their arms around the Warren, and stood there. The deeper the pain, Rick would say later, the fewer words you need. That night, his small group slept on cushions in the kitchen wherever they could find space in the Warren home. They said, "We're not leaving you alone." And they didn't. The next day, Rick wrote to his congregation at Saddleback Church. After 33 years of being their pastor, off standing with them at gravesides, off holding their hands through every crisis imaginable, he told them the truth. No words can express the anguish grief we feel right now. He wrote, "Our youngest son, Matthew, aged 27, and a lifelong member of Saddleback, died today." Had described Matthew's kindness, his compassion, and his brilliant mind. But also said what needed to be said, that despite America's best doctors, best medications, best prayers, the torture of mental illness never subsided. The media exploded. Rick Warren, that purpose-driven pastor, had lost his son to suicide. The irony was too much for some people to resist. How could the man who helped millions find meaning in their lives not save his own child? The criticism came fast and cruel. Some questioned his faith. Others suggested this was God's judgment. Rick ignored most of it. But the weight of public grief is different from private mourning. Everyone wanted a piece of his pain, wanted to understand it, analyze it, use it to prove whatever point they needed to prove. But Rick had other concerns, like planning a funeral that could happen. There was no building in Orange County large enough to hold all the people who wanted to come. Seth Warren made a decision, a private memorial just family. They asked people to honor Matthew's memory by donating to the Matthew Warren Fund for mental health instead. The checks started arriving by the thousands. Rick didn't preach for 4 months, 16 weeks of intentional silence. He stepped away from the pulpit at Saddleback, let other pastors fill in, and spent his days alone with Kay and God. When you spend that much time in serious conversation with the Almighty, Rick said, it changes you. And it did. When he finally returned in late July, standing before his congregation for the first time since Matthew's death, Rick was different. He felt people's pain more deeply now. He teared up easily. He didn't just sympathize anymore. He empathized because now he knew what it felt like to bury your child. The sermon that day was about getting through what you're going through. The topic had been chosen weeks before Matthew's suicide, a cosmic coincidence that felt almost cruel. Rick talked about grief as God's gift, the way we transition through loss. He created stage. Kay stood beside him and wiped tears from his cheek. She told the congregation that Matthew's body was broken, that the gun had broken it, but that he'd be raised in glory. She spoke about missing him, about the broken heart she'd carry until Jesus came for her. And she said something that stopped people cold. It's okay, she said, took through life with tears in your eyes and a smile on your face at the same time. That sermon launched something bigger, a mental health initiative at Sadleach Church, conferences, workshops, support groups. Rick partnered with the Catholic Diocese of Orange, with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, with psychiatrists and counselors, and anyone who would listen. He started asking the question that needed to be asked. There's no shame when your heart fails, no shame when your kidneys stop working. So why do we feel shame when our brains break down? He talked about Matthew openly now, called him brave. Said Matthew was one of the bravest people he'd ever met because he kept going for 10 more years after asking why he couldn't just die. Rick read letters from people Matthew had brought to faith in Christ. Thousands of letters. He wrote in his journal that in God's garden of grace, even broken trees bear fruit. It became his mantra, his way of making sense of the senseless. Matthew's life had meaning even in its brokenness, maybe especially in its brokenness. And Rick forgave not just the gun seller, but life itself. He never questioned his faith in God. He said on CNN months later, he questioned God's plan. There is a difference. He knew God was good. But not everything that happens is God's will, he explained. God allows things because we live in a world of free choices. If Matthew chose to take his own life, Rick couldn't blame God for that. He had to accept it, had to find a way to live with it, and had to figure out how to keep breathing when every instinct said to stop. Rick called Matthew brave. He said it again and again in interviews, in sermons, in quiet conversations with friends. Brave for lasting 27 years. Brave for getting up every morning despite the relentless pain. Brave for trying one more medication, one more therapy session, one more day when everything in him screamed to quit. And maybe Rick was right.